Tonight, how much can we believe about the enemies of the United States? In Angola 10 years ago and in Nicaragua today, we hear accounts of communist expansion. But are such stories true? Tonight, two former CIA officers tell reporter Christopher Hurd how lies invented about Angola and Nicaragua found their way into the world's press. Two experienced journalists tell him the difficulties they've had telling fact from fiction. Some people call this process disinformation, others call it lying. The CIA just call it a standard technique.
The Sandinista dictatorship of Nicaragua, with full Cuban Soviet bloc support, not only persecutes its people, the church, and denies a free press, but arms and provides bases for communist terrorists attacking neighboring states.
As the saying that they have is that this has been said publicly, by the way, by U.S. government spokesman, that our intelligence from Nicaragua is so good, that we can hear the toilets flush in Managua. And I've often thought that might be the source of some of this information.
Angola, a country at war, rich in natural resources, as large as France and Spain together, a left-wing government supported by the Cubans fights a continual battle against a guerrilla army backed by the South Africans. 10 years ago, the Russians and their allies sent troops and guns into a continent where they had no right to be. According to the newspapers at the time, that's how the Angolan War started. Or did it? John Stockwell worked for the CIA for 12 years, rising to the rank of colonel. His last assignment was to run America's secret campaign in Angola.
The CIA had just closed down 3 long-term paramilitary operations in Southeast Asia. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They'd had over 1,000 paramilitary case officers come flocking back to Washington. They didn't have desks for everybody, much less jobs, and morale was rock bottom low. They wanted a covert action. They wanted a paramilitary encounter. Angola was convenient. There never was a study done of who's who.
1974, the Portuguese Revolution. The end of centuries of dictatorship and oppression at home, and of Portuguese imperialism in Africa.
The first briefings on Angola literally went, gentlemen, this is a map of Africa. Here is Angola. And then they went on with a chart to explain there are 3 liberation movements in Angola. One of them is headed by Holden Roberto. He's the good guy. We've worked with him for years, and they use literally good guy. Then the MPLA is headed by this drunken, psychotic Marxist poet, Agostinho Neto. He's the bad guy. And they used exactly so to make sure that people understood. And then, like I say, you pack off and go off to and they come in for the next briefing about Micronesia or somewhere. The superficiality of what I saw fat old men dozing off in subcommittee meetings of the National Security Council, in which we were making decisions that were getting people killed. And I mean exactly the way students do in their 9 o'clock class, propping themselves up and getting their glasses balanced so it won't look, people can't tell if they're, and their heads nodding off. And then you'd have to wake them up sort of to get their concurrence on. So I explained something to them again.
The Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, the MPLA, the largest group, was left-wing. Based in and around the capital, Luanda, its multi-ethnic membership was led by Agostinho Neto and Lucio Lara. The National Front for the Liberation of Angola, the FNLA, operated largely in the north of the country. Its leader, Holden Roberto, a strident anti-communist.
He had been on the payroll of the CIA for 14 years.
The National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi, was based in the south of Angola. A charismatic leader, Savimbi decided that American backing was the key to power. At Alvor in Portugal, the three rival groups got together. They agreed on arrangements for independence and elections.
The United States scotched that, absolutely. Our solution was the CIA, without approval from the National Security Council, delivered $300,000 to Holden Roberto and ordered him to send his people into northern Angola.
We
weren't worried about receiving American aid. We knew that the Soviet Union was supporting the MPLA, and we had no possibility of countering that.
Secretly channeled through Zaire, American money helped pay for Roberto's war on the MPLA.
His side was always the bloodiest, the most violent. They went down and promptly killed 15 MPLA political activists. And from that time on, it was all cast, you know, the fate of Angola was cast, it was written in blood.
The Americans were not sure that Roberto's troops could defeat the MPLA. The Central Intelligence Agency sent John Stockwell to investigate.
Roberto said he had 30,000. I had trouble counting 30. Badly armed, disorganized, kind of rabble kind of troops. And he was a cocktail party cowboy. He'd spent his whole career politicking in Kinshasa. He knew nothing of military operations or logistics or organization.
Then Stockwell went south to UNITA's headquarters. Stockwell met UNITA's leader, Jonas Savimbi.
I found a different kind of revolutionary. He'd spent the entire time inside Angola, 20 years. He had led the guerrilla fighting himself.
Whatever the consequences, whatever the results, we will continue to fight because we don't want to be slaves of Russia in Angola, in our own country.
America was now backing two of the three independence movements. Washington ruled out intervention in Angola with American troops. Instead, it turned, secretly, to South Africa.
The United States at the highest level requested assistance, or rather requested South Africa to go in and assist UNITA.
We did maintain a position of disapproval of apartheid. But on the other hand, the South African government was extremely powerful. There were many people in policy-making positions in the Department of State who were essentially willing to have a funny, ambiguous relationship with South Africa.
We thought, with respect to Angola, that if the Soviet Union could intervene at such distances from areas that were far from the traditional Russian security concerns, and when Cuban forces could be introduced to distant trouble spots, and if the West could not find a counter to that then the whole international system could be destabilized.
The focus was on Soviet penetration and the possibility of the Soviet Union using unstable situations in Africa to benefit itself, to take root and foment trouble.
They were afraid of the MPLA. They called us communists. The South Africans were terrified of the MPLA. They didn't have that terror of the FNLA or UNITA. They were allies. They didn't like the MPLA because the MPLA declared itself against apartheid.
In Luanda, the MPLA was staging parades. In the countryside, it was losing control.
We were alone, poorly equipped, poorly trained, poorly armed. We requested help from the Cubans to help us resist that aggression.
Keen to show leadership in the developing world, Cuba sent 400 military instructors to Luanda. Moscow hadn't been consulted.
The Soviets knew absolutely nothing about it. We took the decision because of our long-standing relations over many years with NATO and with the independence movement in Angola.
In Angola, we're very unhappy. I mean, obviously, we had no desire to see Fidel Castro extend his influence in the African continent. Our government in Washington perceived Fidel Castro as a Soviet proxy.
It was a question of globalizing our struggle vis-à-vis the globalized pressures and harassment of the US. In this respect, it did not coincide with the Soviet viewpoint. We acted, but without their cooperation. Quite the opposite.
But the newspapers contain nothing about the fascinating way in which policy was made. Instead, they fell victim to Stockwell's worldwide campaign of disinformation.
The basic theme was to make it look like a Russian and Cuban aggression in Angola. And so any kind of story that you could write and get into the media anywhere that pushed that line, you did. 1/3 of my staff in this task force was covert action, was propagandists whose professional career jobs was making up stories and finding ways to get them into the press.
Mercenaries in the Central African Republic facing multiple allegations of war crimes, including torture, rape, and murder.
So I went to the British Museum's newspaper library to see how successful Stockwell had been. And here's the story in The Guardian, under the headline, UNITA captures 20 Russians. The UNITA statement, with all its convincing detail, is quoted at length. And according to this, there were 500 Russians and other mercenaries involved in the battle, and there were 2 tanks and 3 armoured cars, and even a house full of arms of Russian make. The Guardian put quotes around the headline to show they weren't quite sure of the story, and presumably that's why they put a question mark after this hopeful little piece. The Melange story also made it to the front page of the Times, which quotes UNITA's claim that they captured 20 Russians in the battle for Melange. The Times clearly believed UNITA because they helpfully tell us that Melange used to be under the control of the MPLA. The source for this story was the Reuters correspondent in Lusaka.
Young Angolan girls. Then there was a battle, and he had that Cuban unit cut off and captured. And then he had the Cuban women, the victims, identifying their rapists. And then there was a trial, and they were convicted. And then he had them executed by a firing squad of the women who had supposedly been violated, with photographs of young African women with weapons shooting down these Cubans. There had never been a rape. There had never been the military action. The Cubans had never been captured. It was all fiction.
Stockwell did extremely well with this story. Here's the Daily Express of March the 12th, 1976. Gun girls execute Cuban rapists is the headline. And quoting from UNITA, it says that 17 Cubans were executed, 5 of whom had been identified as the people who had raped 4 African women a few weeks before. And here's the Evening Standard, with a bit more convincing detail, saying the Cubans were shot with their own guns. And here's the Daily Telegraph, the newspaper of record, adding a bit more detail, identifying the region from which the women came and saying that they took part in the executions. The reporter was John Bullock.
I haven't the faintest idea whether it was true, and I never said it was true. I reported somebody as saying that, as telling me that story. I certainly didn't report the facts. I reported Mr. A or sources from such and such a group as saying that. I don't know whether it was true. If you don't publish it, maybe it is true. You get, I should have thought, worse criticism for not publishing it than for publishing it. Because when you publish it, you do attribute it quite clearly and firmly to a man, a person who's saying so. If you don't publish it, you're already making a judgment. You're deciding it's not true. It's not our job to decide.
Editors are not going, in most Western newspapers, are not going to be too skeptical of Cuban rapist story. It sort of fits the general Western line and what the West wants to read about Cuba and whatnot. The truth is, all of the information we were getting was that the Cubans were handling themselves brilliantly and very generously towards the Africans.
Basically, and to put it very crudely, you can publish any old crap you like, and it will get a newspaper room.
Despite the CIA's best efforts, the armies they supported never stood much of a chance once Cuban soldiers arrived in the autumn of 1975 to help the MPLA. Holden Roberto's FNLA and his CIA mercenaries were wiped out. UNITA and the South Africans beat a hasty retreat. Back in Washington, Congress didn't want another Vietnam and stopped Kissinger from spending any more money in Angola. Interestingly, some American multinationals operating in the country had always supported the MPLA. But when the corporations expressed their views to the American government, they were treated as the enemy.
When we went in, Gulf Oil was pumping the Angolan oil. We forced Gulf to stop. And the way we did this was by Henry Kissinger placing some phone calls and saying that he would open an investigation of international bribery by Gulf Oil Company. The fighting was effectively over in about February of '76. The Congress stopped us then and forced us to withdraw. By early March, within about 3 weeks, Gulf Oil was back with U.S. technicians in Cabinda pumping the Angolan oil, with Cuban soldiers protecting them from CIA mercenaries who were still mucking around in northern Angola.
All these lorries with blood dripping out of it, and it wasn't very nice. And then to go and investigate, and for the first time to see that actually your own troops, it wasn't very nice at all.
They left everything on the field. Men, vehicles, weapons. It was a great victory over the South Africans.
South African and American hopes of a quick victory over the MPLA were crushed. Washington was running out of options.
Right after Vietnam, the American people in no way, and the Congress and the media, would put up with the U.S. putting its forces in to control the outcome of a country that none of the American people were interested in.
The administration fell back on the CIA. It secretly provided money for Roberto and Savimbi to recruit mercenaries from Africa, America, and Europe.
We did kill when we had no particular reason to. We tortured to achieve information that they probably didn't have, and this was not captured enemy soldiers. These were probably just local civilians. And that atmosphere permeated its way through the whole unit. We were just a loose band of bandits with a very dangerous leader and a few associates.
Among the mercenaries, there were some very fine soldiers, Callan, for instance. I've seldom seen such a good soldier. He had phenomenal courage.
He was a psychopath, a raving psychopath, and a couple of men right near him were psychopaths.
13 mercenaries were captured by the MPLA and put on trial. Callan and 3 others were executed. The CIA was still active.
The Congress would have stopped us up front if we had not successfully lied to them, putting in arms, putting in advisors, bringing in South Africa. We kept it propped up for a while, but opposition was mounting.
Still shocked by events in Vietnam, the Congress cut off additional CIA funds for Angola.
This abdication of responsibility by a majority of the Senate will have the gravest consequences for the long-term position of the United States and for international order in general. A great nation cannot escape its responsibilities.
Now, years later, Western corporations are doing business great with Angola. David Rockefeller, Gulf, Boeing, Texaco is building a refinery there, De Beers, working with the diamonds. They all lobby in Washington saying they have no problem doing business with the government of Angola.
But the war still goes on, with the South Africans financing UNITA. The Americans have turned their attention elsewhere, to Nicaragua. Unlike Angola, this is a country which any journalist can visit, so America's lies can be discovered more easily. But these have still dominated the papers. First, there was the arms flow story. According to Reagan, Nicaragua supplied guns to the left-wing guerrillas in neighboring El Salvador. David McMichael was the CIA's senior analyst on Nicaragua. They asked him to write a report on the arms flow. But when he looked at the evidence, it didn't support Reagan's claims.
The argument that we're dealing with here is, do these arms come through or from Nicaragua with the complicity of the Nicaraguan government? And the evidence does not sustain that.
Undeterred, the American government continues to insist that Nicaragua is a center of international communist terrorism. According to Reagan, it harbors members of the IRA, the Red Brigades, the Baader-Meinhof gang, and Basque separatists. So the American government has poured money into supporting the opponents of the Nicaraguan regime.
We have an obligation to be of help where we can to freedom fighters and lovers of freedom and democracy from Afghanistan to Nicaragua.
The freedom fighters he is talking about are called the Contras.
Well, they wouldn't exist without the CIA. They wouldn't. They simply would not exist as a viable force. The Contras never even received money themselves to buy arms. That was all handled for them by the CIA, and there's no way out of saying that the Contra force is essentially and almost entirely a creation of the United States government. The Contras are agents of the United States government.
Since we have been there since the very end of 1981 until now, has been a constant escalation of the war into our area, and there's been a great deal of real terrorism going on in the area. We have mass kidnappings. We've had whole villages that have been swept down on, and they take everyone, women, children, men, animals, everything that moves. We have had rapes and kidnappings, torture, murder, about everything that one could imagine that could happen in a war. And this has been carried out by the Contra.
That is, a standard technique in attempting to destabilize and overthrow a government, is to demonstrate to the citizens of that government, that its government cannot provide security for them. And this is the way to break resistance. And this is what they do. This is the famous CIA manual. The Takayan, laid this out very clearly for them. It's a very, I hate to say it in this cold-blooded way, but it is a standard technique.
To help, the CIA has produced a freedom fighters manual. This shows how to make Molotov cocktails, how to throw them, and who to throw them at. It gives helpful advice on disrupting transport and communications and destroying property. Other standard techniques are aimed at people.
I'm very embarrassed by the United States support for the Contra, and I think it is illegal and immoral. They don't call Ronald Reagan Ronald, they call him Donald Reagan, which is a play on the word to donation, because everything they have is from him.
They are our brothers, these freedom fighters, and we owe them our help. They are the moral equal of our founding fathers and the brave men and women of the French resistance. We cannot turn away from them.
Well, brothers, I suppose, brothers and sisters, we all are of the same God in that sense. Certainly I wouldn't classify them as freedom fighters or as the moral equivalent of our founding fathers in the United States.
In 1981, the CIA asked McMichael for a report on the Nicaraguan press, opposition parties and church.
And my conclusion was that, you know, there was a significant space for these groups to operate, but that they were in no danger of suppression or disappearance. Compared to any other Central American country, Nicaragua has by far the liveliest opposition press and media. Over 2/3, for example, of the 40-odd radio stations in the country are still privately owned and generally speak their mind.
When McMichael spoke his mind, the CIA didn't like it. He was sacked.
The Sandinista dictatorship of Nicaragua, with full Cuban Soviet bloc support, not only persecutes its people, the church, and denies a free press, but arms and provides bases for communist terrorists attacking neighboring states.
I certainly don't recognize any of the diatribes that have been made against the Sandinistas as to the persecution of the church, persecution of peoples, the denial of human rights. That is not in my experience.
After 4 years of fighting the Americans, the Nicaraguan government has now suspended most civil rights. In the world's newsrooms, they are more inclined to listen to the President of America than to the President of Nicaragua. So in the propaganda battle, the CIA's inventions still hit the front page. In 1982, they produced convincing evidence of Soviet bases in Nicaragua.
I used to laugh and say, look at that Soviet-style baseball diamond over there, you know. You know, this is almost foolish, really, you know, to talk about this. First of all, they're not Soviet military bases. That's the whole point. The second is that a barracks is a barracks. You know, an obstacle course is an obstacle course.
How about this for a story? Just under a year ago, the Americans discovered a Soviet freighter carrying MiG fighter planes, which they said were on their way to Nicaragua. Here's the story on the front of the Times. Moscow warned on Nicaraguan MiGs, and there's a picture of a MiG-21. According to President Reagan, this showed that Nicaragua was a threat to the United States.
And as it turned out, this was the evidence for this was based on satellite photography, which showed crates at an East European port facility, which were determined to be, in the science of cratology, the crates of the sort in which MiG aircraft frequently were shipped. And subsequent photographs a day or two later showed that these crates were no longer on the dock. And an amazing leap of logic, it was advanced that necessarily they must have been delivered to Nicaragua, or were on their way to be delivered to Nicaragua. Well, you know, it's the usual thing. The charge makes the headlines. The retraction makes the inside pages. 8 or 10 days later, it's revealed, well, MiGs weren't on the way, but that's no longer a headline. So what one is left with is the overall impression from the screaming headlines of the week earlier that Nicaragua continues to represent this enormous danger to the security of the United States. This nation of 3 million impoverished souls, half of whom are under the age of 15, you know.
Well, I would say people are very silly if they believe everything that newspapers tell them, and I think probably anybody who buys a newspaper needs a course on how to read newspapers.
Part of my reason for coming out of the CIA is that it was a tragedy, a travesty of U.S. principles of freedom and democracy, that you would have the United States setting up a tradition of supporting dictatorships, brutal ones, forming and training their brutal police and death squads, while the Soviet Union, which has had periods of pretty harsh policies towards its own people, is winding up the champion of real freedom throughout the world. If you have a dictator and you want some help getting rid of him, you cannot go to the United States, you can go to the Soviet Union.
People in the foreign policy establishment, let us put it this way, and I believe this is not only true of my own country but many others, you know, believe that in the interest of national policy that it is legitimate to lie. They do not feel it is dishonorable to lie, and when they do lie well, they expect to be rewarded for it.